The emergency room doors burst open with a violent crash that echoed through the sterile corridors of St. Mary's Hospital. Sarah Chen was wheeled in on a stretcher, her small frame barely visible beneath the white sheets stained with dirt and blood. Her long black hair was matted against her pale face, and her breathing came in shallow, labored gasps that made the nurses exchange worried glances. Car accident victim, approximately 28 years old, the paramedic called out as they rushed down the hallway. Found unconscious at the scene. Possible internal injuries, definite concussion, multiple lacerations. Dr. Martinez took one look at the woman and immediately began barking orders. Sarah's eyes fluttered open briefly, revealing dark brown irises that seemed unfocused and confused. She appeared fragile, vulnerable, like a bird with broken wings. Her petite build and delicate features made her look even younger than her years, and there was something about her that made everyone in the room want to protect her. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Dr. Martinez asked gently, leaning over the stretcher. "You've been in an accident. We're going to take good care of you." Sarah's lips moved slightly, but no sound came out. Her hand trembled as she tried to lift it, then fell back to her side with apparent exhaustion. The medical team worked quickly around her, checking vitals, starting IV lines, preparing for X-rays. To everyone watching, she looked like the most helpless person they had ever seen. What none of them knew was that Sarah Chen was calculating. Behind those seemingly dazed eyes, her mind was working with the precision of a trained operative. She was cataloging every person in the room, noting their positions, their body language, their potential threat level. She was listening to every conversation, every medical term, every sound that filtered in from the hallway outside. 3 hours earlier, Sarah had been sitting in a coffee shop 6 blocks away, looking like any other young professional grabbing her morning caffeine fix. She wore a simple blue dress, carried a designer purse, and had been scrolling through her phone with the casual indifference of someone whose biggest worry was whether her latte had enough foam. The truth was far different. Sarah was Lieutenant Sarah Chen, United States Navy SEALs, and she was on the most important mission of her career. For the past 6 months, she had been working undercover to infiltrate a human trafficking ring that had been operating out of the city's downtown area. The criminals were smart, careful, and extremely dangerous. They had evaded law enforcement for years by staying in the shadows and eliminating anyone who got too close to their operation. Sarah's cover identity was perfect. She was supposedly Emma Walsh, a recently divorced marketing consultant who had moved to the city to start fresh after a messy breakup. She had rented a small apartment, joined a gym, even started dating a man named David, who worked at a local bank. Everyone who met Emma saw exactly what Sarah wanted them to see. A somewhat naive woman who was still healing from emotional wounds. Someone who wouldn't pose a threat to anyone. The coffee shop had been chosen deliberately. It sat directly across from the building where the trafficking ring operated their legitimate front business, a small import-export company called Pacific Trading. Sarah had been watching the building for weeks, memorizing the patterns of everyone who came and went, identifying the key players in the organization. That morning, something had changed. She noticed new faces, men in expensive suits who didn't fit the usual pattern. They moved with the confident swagger of people who were used to having power over others. More importantly, she saw them talking to Viktor Petrov, the man she had identified as the ring's leader. Viktor was a tall, thin man with cold blue eyes and prematurely gray hair. On the surface, he appeared to be a successful businessman who had immigrated from Eastern Europe and built a legitimate trading company. But Sarah's investigation had revealed a much darker truth. Viktor was responsible for smuggling dozens of young women into the country, forcing them into lives of exploitation and abuse. As Sarah watched through the coffee shop window, she saw Viktor hand one of the new men a manila envelope. The exchange lasted only seconds, but it told her everything she needed to know. Something big was happening, and it was happening soon. She had been about to call her handler to report the development when she noticed the black sedan parked across the street. The car had been there when she arrived, but now she realized that the 2 men inside were watching her. One of them was speaking into a radio, and his eyes never left the coffee shop window. Sarah's blood turned cold. Her cover had been blown. Years of training kicked in automatically. She couldn't run, that would only confirm their suspicions and put innocent people in danger. She couldn't fight, not here. Not with civilians around. She needed a way out that would keep her cover intact while removing herself from immediate danger. The solution came to her in an instant. Sarah stood up casually, gathered her purse and coffee, and walked toward the exit as if she was simply finishing her morning routine. But as she stepped onto the sidewalk, she deliberately stumbled, dropping her coffee and falling hard onto the concrete. The fall was carefully calculated but looked completely accidental. She hit the ground with enough force to cause real injuries: scraped palms, a cut on her forehead, bruised ribs, but nothing that would cause permanent damage. To anyone watching, it looked like a clumsy accident by someone who was distracted and not paying attention to where she was going. The response was immediate. Concerned pedestrians rushed to help her. Someone called an ambulance. The men in the black sedan had to make a choice: blow their surveillance by intervening, or let the situation play out naturally. They chose to wait and watch, probably assuming that a woman who was injured and headed to the hospital couldn't pose much of a threat to their operation. They had no idea how wrong they were. Now, lying on the hospital bed with monitors beeping around her, Sarah was using her apparent helplessness as the perfect cover to gather intelligence. She had already identified 3 potential exits from the emergency room, noted the locations of all security cameras, and memorized the shift schedules of the nursing staff. Dr. Martinez returned with her X-ray results, his expression serious but not alarmed. "The good news is that there's no sign of internal bleeding or broken bones," he said gently. "You have a mild concussion and some nasty scrapes, but nothing that won't heal with time and rest." Sarah managed a weak smile, playing the role of the grateful patient perfectly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I feel so foolish. I don't even remember what happened." "That's normal with a head injury," the doctor assured her. "We'd like to keep you for observation for at least 24 hours, just to be safe." Perfect, Sarah thought. 24 hours would give her time to plan her next move while maintaining her cover. She let her eyes drift closed, as if the conversation had exhausted her, but her mind was already working on the details of what came next. What she couldn't know was that Victor and his men had not given up their interest in Emma Walsh. While she lay in the hospital bed looking fragile and harmless, they were conducting their own investigation into her background. They were asking questions, checking records, following trails that Sarah had thought were perfectly hidden. In a few hours, they would discover something that would change everything. They would learn that Emma Walsh's driver's license was a forgery. Her social security number belonged to someone else. Her apartment lease had been paid with money that had been laundered through 3 different offshore accounts. Most importantly, they would realize that the woman lying helplessly in St. Mary's Hospital was not who she claimed to be. And when dangerous men like Viktor Petrov felt threatened, they didn't hesitate to eliminate the threat permanently. As the evening shift began at the hospital, Sarah was moved from the emergency room to a private room on the 3rd floor. The nurses who helped with the transfer commented quietly among themselves about how fragile she seemed, how young she looked, how tragic it was that someone so delicate had been hurt. None of them noticed that as they wheeled her through the corridors, Sarah's eyes were mapping every detail of the hospital's layout. She noted the locations of stairwells, elevators, and fire exits. She observed which areas had security coverage and which did not. She counted the number of steps between her room and each potential escape route. In room 314, Sarah was finally alone. She lay still for several minutes, listening to the sounds of the hospital around her. Footsteps in the hallway, the distant ping of elevator doors, the low murmur of conversations at the nurse's station. When she was certain that no one was immediately nearby, she carefully sat up in bed. The movement caused legitimate pain, her ribs were definitely bruised, and her head was pounding from the concussion. But the discomfort was manageable. And more importantly, her injuries were all superficial. She could move when she needed to, and she could fight if the situation demanded it. Sarah reached for her purse, which the nurses had placed in the bedside table. Hidden in a secret compartment that looked like a normal makeup compact was a small communication device that would allow her to contact her handler. She needed to report what she had observed at the coffee shop, and update the team on her current situation. But as she reached for the device, she heard something that made her freeze. Voices in the hallway, speaking in hushed tones that carried the unmistakable edge of menace. "Room 314, one voice said. "The nurse said she's sleeping." "Good," replied another voice with a slight accent that Sarah recognized immediately. "Viktor Petrov. We need to have a conversation with Miss Walsh about her real identity." Sarah's heart rate spiked, but her expression remained calm. Years of training had taught her to control her physical responses, even in the most dangerous situations. She carefully placed the communication device back in her purse and lay down, arranging herself to look as helpless and vulnerable as possible. She heard footsteps approaching her door. 2 sets, moving with the confident stride of men who were used to getting what they wanted through intimidation and violence. In a few seconds, they would enter her room expecting to find a defenseless woman who couldn't possibly threaten their operation. They were about to discover just how wrong they could be. Sarah closed her eyes and controlled her breathing, making it appear slow and labored. Her hands lay limply at her sides, and her face showed no sign of the alertness that was coursing through her system. To anyone looking at her, she appeared to be exactly what she had seemed all day. A fragile, injured woman who posed no danger to anyone. The door handle turned slowly, and Sarah prepared herself for what was about to happen. Her cover was blown, her mission was compromised, and 2 dangerous men were about to enter her room with unknown but certainly hostile intentions. But Sarah Chen had not survived years as a Navy SEAL by backing down from dangerous situations. She had been trained for exactly this kind of moment, when everything went wrong, and she had to rely on her skills, her intelligence, and her willingness to do whatever it took to complete her mission. The door opened, and Sarah continued to lie still, looking helpless and unaware. Viktor and his companion stepped into the room, their footsteps muffled by the hospital linoleum, but their presence filling the space with an aura of threat and violence. What happened next would determine not only Sarah's fate, but the fate of the dozens of young women whose lives depended on her mission's success. The trafficking ring had operated with impunity for too long, destroying lives and profiting from human misery. Sarah was the only person positioned to bring them down, but first she had to survive the next few minutes. As the 2 men approached her bed, Sarah remained perfectly still, every muscle in her body ready to explode into action at the right moment. She looked like a helpless victim, but she was actually a weapon waiting to be unleashed. The moment of truth was approaching, and Sarah Chen was ready for war. Viktor Petrov stood at the foot of the hospital bed, studying the seemingly unconscious woman with cold, calculating eyes. His companion, a thick-set man named Dmitri, positioned himself near the door to keep watch. Both men moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this kind of work many times before. "Emma Walsh," Viktor said softly, his accent making the fake name sound even more artificial. "Or should I say, whoever you really are." "Emma Walsh." Sarah maintained her facade of unconsciousness, but every fiber of her being was alert and ready. Through her barely open eyelashes, she could see Viktor pulling out his cell phone and showing something to Dmitri. Probably photographs, she realized. They had been investigating her background and had discovered inconsistencies in her cover story. "The apartment lease was paid through a shell company," Viktor continued, speaking as if he expected her to respond. "The social security number belongs to a woman who died 3 years ago in Oregon. The employment history is fabricated, the references are fake, and the emergency contacts don't exist." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But what's really interesting is what we found when we ran facial recognition software on the security camera footage from the coffee shop. You're very good at changing your appearance, but technology doesn't lie." Sarah's mind raced. They had identified her, which meant her real identity was compromised. Worse, if they knew who she was, they might know about the broader investigation. The entire operation could be in jeopardy. Viktor circled around to the side of the bed, his movements predatory. "Lieutenant Sarah Chen, United States Navy SEALs." Quite impressive credentials for someone who looked so helpless lying there. The mention of her real name sent a surge of adrenaline through Sarah's system, but she forced herself to remain still. She needed them to get closer, to position themselves where she could neutralize both threats quickly and quietly. A hospital was full of innocent people, and she couldn't risk a prolonged fight that might endanger civilians. The question is, Victor continued, how much does your government know about our operation? How long have you been watching us? And more importantly, who else is involved? Dmitri shifted nervously by the door. We should just finish this now, he said in heavily accented English. Too dangerous to leave her alive. Patience, Victor replied. First, she's going to answer some questions. Then we'll dispose of her in a way that looks like a tragic complication from her accident. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small syringe filled with clear liquid. This will make you more cooperative, he said, moving toward Sarah's IV line. A little something to loosen your tongue before we have our real conversation. This was the moment Sarah had been waiting for. Victor was focused on the syringe, standing close to the bed with his attention divided. Dmitri was still by the door, far enough away that he couldn't intervene immediately. The setup was as good as it was going to get. Sarah's eyes snapped open just as Victor reached for her IV port. In one fluid motion that seemed to defy the laws of physics, she grabbed his wrist with her right hand, while her left hand shot up to his throat. Her grip was precise, targeting the carotid artery with pressure that would render him unconscious in seconds. But Victor was faster than she had expected. He jerked backward, breaking free from her grip and stumbling away from the bed. The syringe fell to the floor with a small crash that echoed in the quiet room. She's awake, he shouted to Dmitri, who immediately began moving toward the bed while reaching inside his jacket for what was certainly a concealed weapon. Sarah rolled off the far side of the bed with a grace that contradicted everything about her appearance over the past several hours. Her hospital gown fluttered as she moved. But her movements were those of a trained warrior, not an injured victim. She landed in a crouch, using the bed as a barrier between herself and the two men. Impossible, Victor breathed, staring at the transformation. The helpless woman was gone, replaced by someone whose entire posture radiated deadly competence. Sarah stood slowly, her dark eyes now sharp and focused with an intensity that made both men take an involuntary step backward. The facade of vulnerability had completely disappeared, revealing the predator that had been hidden underneath. You made a mistake coming here, she said quietly, her voice steady and calm despite the situation. You should have stayed away. Dmitri finally managed to pull his gun from his jacket holster, but Sarah was already moving. She grabbed the IV pole next to the bed and spun it like a staff, the metal rod connecting with his wrist with a sharp crack that sent the weapon flying across the room. Before Dmitri could react to the loss of his gun, Sarah continued the spinning motion and brought the IV pole around in a wide arc that caught him in the solar plexus. The big man doubled over, gasping for air, and Sarah finished the combination by bringing her knee up to meet his descending face. Dmitri collapsed to the floor, unconscious before he hit the linoleum. The entire sequence had taken less than 5 seconds. Victor stared in shock at his fallen companion, then back at Sarah, who was now holding the IV pole like a weapon while maintaining a defensive stance that kept the bed between them. Who are you? He whispered, though he already knew the answer. I'm the person who's been watching you for 6 months, Sarah replied. I know about the warehouses on 5th Street. I know about the shipping containers that arrive every Tuesday night. I know about the girls you've been bringing into the country, and I know about the buyers who pay for them. Victor's face went pale. You can't prove anything. I don't have to prove it, Sarah said. I just have to stop it. Victor glanced toward the door, calculating his chances of escape. Sarah followed his gaze and shook her head slightly. Don't, she warned. You won't make it to the hallway. But desperation made Victor reckless. He lunged toward the door, shouting for help as he moved. Sarah reacted instantly, throwing the IV pole like a spear. The metal rod struck Victor in the back of the legs, sending him crashing to the floor just inside the doorway. Sarah was on him before he could get back up, using a restraint technique that would keep him immobilized without causing permanent injury. Victor struggled for a moment, then went limp as he realized the futility of resistance. Listen carefully, Sarah said, her voice low and dangerous. You're going to answer my questions, And you're going to tell me everything I need to know to shut down your operation. If you cooperate, you'll live long enough to face trial. If you don't, she let the threat hang in the air. The door to the hospital room suddenly burst open, and two nurses rushed in, drawn by the commotion. They stopped short when they saw the scene. Two unconscious men on the floor, medical equipment scattered around the room, and their supposedly helpless patient standing over one of the intruders, with the calm confidence of someone completely in control. "Call security," Sarah told them without taking her eyes off Victor. "And call the police. Tell them you need federal agents here immediately." One of the nurses fumbled for her phone while the other stared in confusion at the transformation they had witnessed. The fragile, injured woman they had been caring for had somehow become someone entirely different. "I don't understand," the older nurse said. "Who are you?" Sarah looked up at her with a slight smile. "I'm someone who's very good at pretending to be helpless when it serves my purpose." Within minutes, the hospital room was filled with security guards, local police, and federal agents who had been summoned by calls that started at the highest levels of the government. Sarah identified herself to the lead agent, who immediately began coordinating with her handler to secure the scene and process the prisoners. Victor was conscious but clearly shaken by how quickly his situation had changed. One moment he had been in control, ready to interrogate and eliminate what he thought was a helpless target. The next moment he was facing someone whose skills far exceeded anything he had encountered in his criminal career. "You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into," he told Sarah as the federal agents prepared to transport him. "This operation is bigger than you know. There are people involved who will make sure you disappear permanently." Sarah knelt down next to him, her expression serious. "Then you'd better help me find them before they find me." The interrogation that followed would last for hours, but Victor's cooperation was ensured by his realization that Sarah and her team represented his only chance of survival. The trafficking ring he worked for did not tolerate failure or exposure, and they would certainly kill him to protect their operation. As the hospital room was cleared and the investigation began in earnest, Sarah finally had a moment to assess her situation. Her cover was blown. Her mission had been compromised. But she had gained something valuable. A direct line to the heart of the trafficking operation. Dr. Martinez appeared in the doorway, looking bewildered by the chaos that had erupted in his normally quiet hospital. "I need to examine you," he said to Sarah. "Make sure you weren't injured in the fight." Sarah nodded, suddenly aware that the adrenaline was wearing off, and her earlier injuries were making themselves known again. "I'm fine," she said, though she knew that wasn't entirely true. "You were in a car accident this morning," the doctor reminded her. "You had a concussion and multiple injuries. Now you've been involved in what appears to be some kind of combat situation. I need to make sure you haven't exacerbated your condition." As Dr. Martinez checked her pupils and tested her reflexes, Sarah reflected on how much her situation had changed in just a few hours. This morning she had been Emma Walsh, a mild-mannered marketing consultant recovering from a messy divorce. Tonight she was Lieutenant Sarah Chen again. And her real work was just beginning. The federal agents had taken Victor and Dmitri into custody, but Sarah knew that the trafficking ring would quickly realize that their operation had been exposed. They would move their assets, change their procedures, and eliminate anyone who might pose a threat to their continued operation. Most importantly, they would come after her. Agent Rodriguez, her primary handler for the undercover operation, arrived at the hospital just as Dr. Martinez was finishing his examination. He was a tall, serious man in his 50s who had been running undercover operations for more than 2 decades. "Are you all right?" he asked Sarah as they moved to a private consultation room away from the chaos. "I'm fine," Sarah replied. "But the operation is compromised. They know who I am, and they'll assume the entire investigation has been exposed." Rodriguez nodded grimly. "We've been monitoring their communications since Victor was arrested. You're right. They're already moving to protect their assets. But we may have an opportunity here." He pulled out a tablet and showed Sarah a series of photographs and surveillance reports. "Victor's been more cooperative than we expected. He's given us locations, names, and operational details that we've been trying to discover for months. But more importantly, He's agreed to help us with something bigger. Sarah studied the information, her mind already working through the implications. What kind of help? There's a major shipment arriving tomorrow night, Rodriguez explained. 47 girls from Eastern Europe, scheduled to be distributed to buyers across the country. Victor says, if we move quickly, we can intercept the shipment and arrest the entire leadership structure in one operation. And the catch? Sarah asked. Because there was always a catch in operations like this. You'll have to go back undercover, Rodriguez said. Different identity, different approach, but still undercover. The leadership doesn't know that Victor's been arrested, yet they think he's still investigating the Emma Walsh situation. If you can convince them that you neutralized the threat, you might be able to get close enough to the shipment to coordinate the takedown. Sarah considered the proposal. Going back undercover so soon after her identity had been compromised was extremely dangerous. The trafficking ring would be on high alert, suspicious of anyone and everyone who came near their operation. If they discovered her real identity a second time, there would be no opportunity for escape. But 47 lives hung in the balance. 47 young women who had been torn from their homes and families, who were about to be sold into lives of exploitation and abuse. Sarah had joined the Navy SEALs to protect people who couldn't protect themselves, and this was exactly the kind of situation her training had prepared her for. What's the timeline? She asked. 18 hours, Rodriguez replied. The shipment arrives tomorrow at midnight. Sarah looked at her reflection in the darkened window of the consultation room. Her hair was still disheveled from her supposed accident. Her face showed the fatigue of a long and stressful day, and she was wearing a hospital gown that made her look vulnerable and harmless. Perfect, she thought. Sometimes the best disguise was the one people least expected. I'll need a new identity by morning, she said to Rodriguez. And I'll need backup positioned close enough to respond if things go wrong, but far enough away that they won't be detected. Rodriguez smiled for the first time since entering the hospital. I was hoping you'd say that. As they began planning the details of the new operation, Sarah felt a familiar sensation, the calm focus that came with preparing for a mission that would test every skill she had learned and every ounce of courage she possessed. Tomorrow night, she would once again become someone else, infiltrating an organization that had already tried to kill her once. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the margin for error was essentially zero. But Lieutenant Sarah Chen had never backed down from a challenge, and she wasn't about to start now. The warehouse district at 11:30 at night was a maze of shadows and silence, broken only by the distant sound of traffic from the main highway and the occasional call of seagulls from the nearby harbor. Sarah Chen moved through the darkness like a ghost, her new identity as complete and convincing as the one that had been blown less than 24 hours earlier. She was now Maria Santos, a buyer representing a high-end clientele from California. The story was that she had driven across the country specifically for this transaction, bringing cash and connections that the trafficking ring desperately needed. Her appearance had been completely transformed, shorter hair dyed auburn, contact lenses that changed her eye color to green, and carefully applied makeup that altered the apparent shape of her face. More importantly, her entire demeanor was different. Where Emma Walsh had been vulnerable and naive, Maria Santos was confident and slightly predatory. She carried herself like someone who was used to getting what she wanted through a combination of money and intimidation. The transformation was so complete that even her own teammates had done double takes when they saw her during the final briefing. The operation had been planned with military precision, but success depended entirely on Sarah's ability to get inside the warehouse and confirm the location of the victims before the tactical teams moved in. Intelligence suggested that the 47 women were being held in a secured area within the building, but the exact layout was unknown. Sarah approached the main entrance of Warehouse 7, her heels clicking confidently on the concrete. She wore an expensive business suit and carried a briefcase that contained both the props needed to maintain her cover and the communication equipment that would coordinate the rescue operation. 2 guards stood by the entrance, both carrying concealed weapons, and both studying her with the suspicious attention of men who were used to dealing with dangerous people. Sarah walked directly up to them without hesitation, projecting the kind of confidence that came with both money and power. "I'm here for the Santos transaction," she said simply, her voice carrying just a hint of impatience. I believe Mr. Volkov is expecting me. The guards exchanged glances, and one of them spoke into a radio in a language Sarah recognized as Russian. After a brief conversation, he nodded and gestured toward the entrance. You will need to be searched before proceeding, he said in heavily accented English. Sarah submitted to the search with the annoyed tolerance of someone who understood the necessity but found it personally insulting. The guards were thorough but not overly invasive, and they missed the tiny communication device hidden in the heel of her left shoe and the small tracking beacon sewn into the lining of her jacket. Once inside the warehouse, Sarah was escorted through a maze of shipping containers and industrial equipment toward the back of the building. The space was dimly lit, with pools of harsh light from overhead fixtures creating alternating areas of visibility and deep shadow. The air smelled of diesel fuel, rust, and something else she couldn't quite identify. As they walked deeper into the warehouse, Sarah began to hear sounds that made her stomach tighten with anger. Muffled voices speaking in what sounded like several different languages. The occasional sob or cry that was quickly suppressed. The sounds of people in distress, trying to remain quiet out of fear. Her escort led her to an office area that had been constructed within the warehouse space, complete with windows that looked out over the main floor. Through the glass, Sarah could see additional guards positioned around the perimeter of the building and near what appeared to be a secured area surrounded by chain-link fencing. The door to the office opened, and Alexei Volkov entered the room. He was a bear of a man, tall and broad with the kind of presence that filled any space he occupied. His expensive suit couldn't disguise the fact that he had the build and scars of someone who had spent years enforcing his will through violence. "Miss Santos," he said, extending a hand that was roughly the size of a dinner plate. "I trust your journey from California was comfortable?" Sarah shook his hand with a firm grip, making eye contact with the confident directness that her cover identity demanded. "Long but productive," she replied. "I'm eager to see the merchandise and complete our transaction." Volkov gestured toward a chair, and Sarah sat down with the relaxed posture of someone who was completely comfortable with the situation. Inside, however, her mind was cataloging every detail of the office and the warehouse beyond. She could see at least 12 guards, multiple exit routes, and several areas where civilians might be at risk if the operation went wrong. "Before we proceed," Volkov said, settling into the chair behind his desk, "I need to address a situation that developed yesterday. One of our security consultants encountered some difficulties while investigating a potential threat to our operation." Sarah's pulse quickened, but her expression remained neutral. "Oh? Nothing that affects our business, I hope. We believe the threat has been neutralized," Volkov continued, studying her face for any reaction. "A federal agent who had been conducting surveillance was involved in a traffic accident and later died from complications. The investigation into our activities has been suspended." Sarah nodded sympathetically while fighting down a surge of revulsion at how casually he discussed what he believed was her death. "These government people can be so persistent," she said. "It's fortunate that the situation resolved itself without requiring more direct intervention." Volkov smiled, apparently satisfied with her response. "Indeed. Now, shall we proceed with your inspection of the merchandise?" He led her out of the office and toward the secured area she had observed earlier. As they approached the chain-link enclosure, Sarah could see movement inside dozens of young women sitting on makeshift bedding, their faces showing the hollow exhaustion of people who had endured weeks or months of captivity. The sight filled Sarah with a cold rage that she had to work hard to conceal. These women had been stolen from their lives and families, transported thousands of miles from home, and reduced to merchandise in a business transaction. Some appeared to be teenagers, barely older than children. 47 units, Volkov said with the casual tone of someone discussing livestock. "All healthy, all properly prepared for distribution. The documentation for transport is included in the price." Sarah forced herself to nod approvingly while studying the layout of the enclosure and the positions of the guards. She could see that the women were being held in what had once been a loading dock area, with concrete walls on 3 sides and the chain-link fence completing the enclosure. There were only 2 entrances, both heavily guarded. "Very impressive," she said. "I'll need a few minutes to complete my evaluation," before we finalize the financial arrangements." Volkov gestured to one of his men, who unlocked the gate to the enclosure. Sarah entered with the predatory confidence of her cover identity. But as she moved among the captive women, she was actually looking for the best way to protect them when the tactical teams moved in. Many of the women looked up at her with expressions of fear and despair, clearly understanding what her presence meant for their futures. Sarah wanted desperately to reassure them, to let them know that help was coming, but she couldn't break character without endangering the entire operation. Instead, she moved through the space like someone conducting a business inspection, mentally noting the positions of each person and identifying the women who appeared to be injured or in immediate medical distress. When the rescue began, these would be her first priority. As she completed her circuit of the enclosure, Sarah palmed the small communication device from her shoe and activated it with a subtle gesture that would appear to be adjusting her jacket. The signal would alert the tactical teams that she was in position and ready for the operation to begin. "Satisfactory," she told Volkov as she exited the enclosure. "I'm prepared to complete the transaction." Volkov led her back toward the office area, but as they walked, Sarah noticed that something had changed. There were more guards visible now, and they were positioned differently than before. Several of them were watching her specifically, their body language tense and alert. Her suspicion was confirmed when they reached the office and she saw two new faces waiting inside. Both men wore expensive suits, but they had the unmistakable bearing of professional killers. One of them was holding a tablet computer that showed what appeared to be surveillance footage. "Miss Santos," Volkov said, his tone now completely different. "Or should I say, Lieutenant Chen?" Sarah's mind raced as she realized that her second cover had been blown as well. Somehow, they had identified her despite all the precautions and preparation. But she maintained her composure, continuing to play her role even as she prepared for the fight that was about to begin. "I'm sorry," she said, injecting just the right amount of confusion into her voice. "I think there's been some kind of mistake." One of the new arrivals stepped forward and turned the tablet so she could see the screen. The footage showed her entering the hospital the previous morning, but the image quality was much better than she had expected. High-definition cameras with facial recognition capability had captured her face clearly enough to identify her even through her disguise. "Advanced surveillance technology," the man explained. "We've been upgrading our security systems to deal with exactly this kind of infiltration." Volkov moved around his desk and picked up a handgun that had been lying in one of the drawers. "The question is, how much does your government know about tonight's operation?" Sarah realized that her communication device had sent its signal, which meant the tactical teams were already moving into position. But they wouldn't begin their assault for another 10 minutes, which was the planned interval to allow her time to get clear of the immediate danger zone. 10 minutes was an eternity in a situation like this. "I think you're confused," Sarah said, still maintaining her cover. "I don't know what you're talking about." Quote, the second newcomer stepped forward and showed her a different image on his tablet. This one showed her leaving the hospital the previous evening, clearly identifying her as the same person who had been involved in Victor's capture. "Victor told us everything before he died," Volkov said coldly. "About your real identity, about the federal investigation, about the plan to intercept tonight's shipment. What he didn't tell us was how many agents are involved and when they plan to move." Sarah felt a chill as she processed what he had said. Victor was dead, which meant her only source of intelligence about the trafficking ring's structure had been eliminated. Worse, if they had interrogated him before killing him, they might know about the tactical teams that were approaching the warehouse. She needed to buy time and create a diversion that would give the rescue teams the best possible chance of success. More importantly, she needed to protect the 47 women who were depending on her to get them out of this nightmare. "You want to know when they plan to move?" Sarah asked, abandoning her cover identity entirely. "They're already here." The words had barely left her mouth when the lights went out, plunging the warehouse into complete darkness. The tactical teams had arrived ahead of schedule and were beginning their assault with the systematic precision that had made Navy SEALs legendary. Sarah moved immediately, using the darkness and the confusion to her advantage. She could hear Volkov and his men shouting commands in Russian, trying to coordinate their response to an attack they hadn't expected. But Sarah had been briefed on the tactical plan, and she knew exactly where her teammates would be coming from. The office windows exploded inward as flashbang grenades detonated throughout the warehouse. The combination of blinding light and deafening noise was designed to disorient the criminals, while giving the tactical teams a crucial advantage in the opening moments of the assault. Sarah used the chaos to neutralize the gunman closest to her, using a takedown technique that left him unconscious but alive. She needed at least some of the trafficking ring's leadership to survive for interrogation. But her primary concern was reaching the enclosure where the captive women were being held. Gunfire erupted throughout the warehouse as Volkov's men tried to mount a defense against the assault teams. Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of military-grade weapons, which meant her teammates had encountered serious resistance. But the tactical plan had anticipated this, and the teams were equipped and trained to handle armed opposition. Sarah made her way through the dark warehouse using a combination of memory and instinct, navigating around obstacles and moving toward the sound of frightened voices from the enclosure area. She could hear women crying and calling out in several different languages, terrified by the noise and violence erupting around them. When she reached the enclosure, she found that the guards had abandoned their posts to join the fight elsewhere in the warehouse. The gate was still locked, but Sarah had the tools and training to deal with that obstacle. "Listen to me," she called out in English, then repeated the message in Spanish and Russian. "I'm here to help you. Stay low and stay together. We're getting you out of here." As she worked on the lock, Sarah could hear the battle raging throughout the rest of the warehouse. The tactical teams were systematically clearing each area, but the criminals were fighting back with the desperation of people who knew that capture meant life in prison. The lock clicked open, and Sarah swung the gate wide. "Move toward the back wall and stay together," she instructed the women. "Help anyone who can't walk on their own." The women began to move with the careful coordination of people who had learned to work together for survival. Some helped others who were injured or weak, and they formed a protective group around the youngest members of their number. Sarah led them toward an exit that she knew the tactical teams had secured, moving carefully through the darkness while staying alert for any remaining threats. Behind them, the sounds of combat were beginning to diminish as the assault teams gained control of the warehouse. As they reached the secured exit, Sarah could see emergency vehicles with their lights flashing in the parking area outside. Paramedics and federal agents were waiting to provide medical care and begin the process of helping the rescued women contact their families and begin the long journey toward recovery. "You're safe now," Sarah told them as they emerged into the night air. "These people will take care of you." The operation had been a complete success. All 47 women had been rescued without serious injury. The entire leadership structure of the trafficking ring had been either captured or eliminated. Most importantly, the investigation had uncovered evidence that would allow law enforcement to dismantle similar operations throughout the country. Agent Rodriguez approached Sarah as she watched the rescued women being cared for by the medical teams. "Outstanding work," he said simply. "How are you holding up?" Sarah looked back at the warehouse where she had spent the most intense and dangerous 18 hours of her career. "I'm good," she said, "but I'll be better when I know these women are all safely home with their families." Rodriguez nodded. "That's going to take time, but it will happen. And because of what you did here, it's going to happen for a lot of other women who might have ended up in situations like this." As the sun began to rise over the harbor, Sarah reflected on the mission that had started with her pretending to be helpless and vulnerable. She had used that appearance of weakness as both a shield and a weapon, allowing her to get close to her targets and ultimately destroy an operation that had caused immeasurable suffering. The trafficking ring was finished. Its leadership in custody or dead, its assets seized, and its victims free. But Sarah knew that this was just one victory in a much larger war. There were other criminals, other operations, other people who needed someone to stand between them and those who would harm them. Lieutenant Sarah Chen would be ready for whatever came next. After all, sometimes the most dangerous person in the room was the one who looked the most helpless. And she had proven that looking helpless could be the perfect disguise for a warrior.